This might be just a sign of me growing up in churches in the 90s, but how many of you remember those WWJD bracelets that everyone and their puppies had, right? So these things were everywhere, right? And everyone had them, and if you didn't wear one to school, all your Christian friends would be like, are you okay? Are you ashamed of Jesus? Is that what the problem is? Do we need to pray for you more? And just on and on. But there's a problem with these WWJD bracelets. And remember, they stand for What Would Jesus Do? And the idea behind them is when you find yourself in a situation, ask yourself, what would Jesus do? Now, this is usually a good idea, but with today's gospel lesson, it backfires. Because what Jesus would do is fashion a whip and drive people out of the temple. It's an interesting thing for Jesus to do. He goes to the temple just before Passover, and he sees in the outer court of the temple people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, which are all the things that one would need to come to the temple and offer your sacrifice. And then there were folk changing money from one currency to another, which is another thing that would be rather helpful. And then you could just purchase whatever animal you have with whatever currency you had. To my brain, this sounds like a great system. I don't know about you, but if I am traveling from somewhere and I've already got my kids with me and I'm traveling the long walk from wherever you are to Jerusalem, you don't want to wrangle kids and an animal. Like, the kids, that's bad enough, right? Trying to travel with kids, I know I've heard it's miserable. I remember being a kid and being miserable to travel with. But kids and an animal, I mean, just let's keep it to one or the other, right? So it makes sense that when you, instead of bringing an animal with you to Jerusalem, you can just buy one there. And instead of having to figure out whatever currency is in favor in the temple these days, you can just go to someone and say, hey, I've got all these Roman coins. And they say, okay, we'll make those Roman coins into temple coins, and then you'll be all set. It sounds like a really good idea. So why did Jesus get so mad at it? Now, there's two reasons. There's one that requires a logical jump, and another one that really doesn't require as much of a logical jump, and probably makes more sense anyways. The one that requires the leap is, well, the people in the temple were dishonest, and that's why Jesus didn't like it. It's actually the temple that whoever wrote our prayer of the day today went with. There's no evidence that these people in the temple were dishonest, though. That's the problem. There's nothing in the Bible that says Jesus drove out these people because they were selling at inflated prices and they gave terrible rates of exchange. Doesn't say that. I think the reason why Jesus was so upset is these folk weren't just in the area surrounding the temple. They were actually in the temple, in the only place that people who weren't Jewish could come and worship God. You see where this might be a problem. Well, actually, let me give you an example. How many of you, just quick raise of hands, think it would be a terrible idea to put an ATM in the church? It's a pretty good number of hands, right? Seems like an awful idea. Okay, how many of you have forgotten your offering? Right? How easy would it be if you forgot your offering to go to an ATM and then just get money out and put it in the plate? But you can see why people would make that idea, right? You can see where someone would go, oh, this sounds like a great idea. Let's do this. And that's probably how they went from whatever system they started with, which was bring your own animal to the temple, to this issue of people selling sheep and changing money in the temple. People didn't want to travel with an animal with them to Jerusalem. So some merchant had this great idea. You know what? I'm going to have some sheep. I'm going to set up a booth. I'm going to sell sheep. I'm going to sell cows. I'm going to sell doves. I mean, that's just capitalism, right? There was a demand. Someone developed a supply. There you go. It's a great opportunity to make some money and make it convenient for people. Now, I think all of this would have been just fine. The actual system itself, I don't think Jesus had a problem with, except they started doing it in the temple. And I bet that's not how it started. I bet it was a merchant like outside the temple. And then it just kind of moved. And little by little over time, you end up with all of these merchants in the outer court of the temple. Like having an ATM in the narthex, for instance. Right. But over time, you could see very easily how people would just accept that that's a thing that's okay. Now, Jesus, of course, did not think that was okay at all. Jesus thought that the temple was a place where people should come and worship God. You shouldn't buy and sell things in the temple, and it was especially egregious because the part of the temple that you could go to if you were in was just fine. The part of the temple that you could go to if you were Jewish, that was fine. People were worshiping there. The area that Jesus was clearing people out of was the place where the people who wanted to worship God but weren't Jewish could go. I mean, this adds a level of xenophobic racism to the story that you miss if you're just talking about, oh, it's the outer court of the temple. No, it's specifically the Gentile court of the temple. The place where the outsiders who want to come in can come and greet God. And so Jesus clears them all out, making the temple again a place of worship. Now, I used the example of an ATM earlier because it's kind of obvious. Like, we'd all get uncomfortable about that. And when we raised our hands, we all were uncomfortable about that. But what things might we do in church that actually take away from worshiping God? What things might we do that cause problems for folk if they're coming in for the first time and want to worship God with us? That question is actually one of the reasons why we started having everything projected on the wall. Somebody noticed that a visitor had come to church one day and was juggling our books and had no idea what to do and said, why don't we give this a shot? It's finding these things that make it hard for people to worship God and try to make it easier. Try to find things that get in the way of people worshiping God and making them go away. And it's finding things that are good ideas that might not actually be such good ideas. Because it's amazing how quickly something that starts off as a good idea could turn into something harmful. Oftentimes in our Lutheran churches, even something that is so important as the liturgy can become a thing that gets in the way of us worshiping God. The environment that we are in can become a detriment if it becomes something we just do. We were talking in Sunday school earlier about how easy it is for the creed and the Lord's Prayer to just become something we say, to just be something that we repeat and don't really mean. Then even those things become something that get in the way of our worship. So it's a very important question that we as Christians need to ask ourselves, what is in the way of me worshiping God? What is in the way of others worshiping God? It might be something big. We might have money changers in our temple that need to be kicked out, and maybe that's our problem. I don't think so. I would hope we would notice something like that. But it could be also just be something small that keeps us from worshiping God, something that distracts us from the reason that we gather together. Because like the temple was a place for folk to gather together and worship God, this building is a place for people to gather together to worship God. And if we're not doing everything that we can to worship, then we're doing something wrong. There's an old song. I don't know how many of y'all remember this. I'm full of old like camp songs. And I don't remember the melody of this one, but I always remember the rhyme. The church is not a steeple. The church is the people. There's hand motions and everything too. Like I don't know if I can even do it anymore. It's like, put your hands like this, and then you open the church. Yeah, here's the church, and here's the steeple. Open it up. Yeah. Y'all get the idea. When we gather together as a church, when we gather together in this place as a church, it is to worship God. We gather together to worship and be strengthened in that worship to live out the Christian life. And if we have something that's keeping us from that, whether it's a grocery list or the nap when the pastor's voice gets extra soothing, or if there's hymns we don't like. For me, there are certain styles of worship that I just don't like. I have a really hard time getting into the spirit of worship when music is, I like big, boisterous, loud worship music. That's just how I am. It's a problem I have that I can't worship God if I don't have big, loud, boisterous church music. That's on me. But that's something that I know that keeps me from worshiping God. It's something that makes my brain, for some reason, focus on everything I don't like and forget the whole point. Because again, why do we gather? What is this place for? To worship God. So what are those things in our lives that keep us from worshiping? What are the things that Jesus would drive out of our lives to keep us from worshiping God? Because that's what it's all about. Gathering together to give praise and honor to the one who created us, the one who saves us, so that we can worship God and come to know Him better through our worship.